All right. In English, this was the first thing that turned all of our heads. Jan plays a different move than we all predicted on move 1.
Yeah, I think it was a good choice. He looked like he was ready in these c4 lines. It looked like he knew pretty much what to do. And it also threw Magnus off a bit, because I think everyone around the world was predicting e4.
Yep.
Jan hadn't showed much flexibility both with his white repertoire and with his black repertoire in previous games. So we thought he was just sticking to his guns. But instead he went for an entirely different approach, one that I think worked pretty well.
Yep.
And yeah, Magnus, the other surprise was that Magnus played a very sharp and unusual line rather than taking on c4 at some moment, leading to somewhat more simplified and balanced positions. He chose the most aggressive, ambitious approach, but one which also gives white a great amount of possibility to play for an advantage.
Yep. Well, in the game, we got that double-edged type of position you're talking about with a Benoni structure, if you will. For those who want to look up the Benoni chess opening, you can just Google or do so at chess.com/openings. But it's important because this position on the board after d3, knight f6, knight bd2, a5, Robert, is one that you can see with colors reversed, a la the Benoni, but also was already very critical and had a lot of forcing lines ahead.
Yeah, the colors reversed is key here because white gets an extra tempo. So when white goes knight at b3, you're attacking the bishop on c5, kicking it back to the e7 square, and then we saw white strike with e3. So suddenly the position is opening up. White has this light square bishop, has already castled. So for the time being, it should be at least a slight edge for the white pieces.
And arguably, it was a slight edge for the white pieces after d takes e3. Again, in real time, we spent some time highlighting why the moves e5, traditional Benoni type of moves don't work. I'll summarize Fabi's points very quickly with saying that, among other things, ideas where the rook comes to e1 and the bishop comes to f4 with knight e5 ultimately leave this d-pawn a little tender here, and black has to be very careful before opening and extending the center. Because of that, the trade occurred, and already after bishop e3, we're looking at a position where we started to like white. Then Magnus uncorks the surprising and very, very direct knight g4.
Yeah, I think we were expecting Magnus to castle and go for a slightly slower type of position. Knight to g4 suggested to me that he was sort of ready for this position, but it's unclear even now to me how ready he was, because although he was playing a very unusual line, one where you would expect him to be prepared for, a very risky line as well, he still got into some danger, and he was burning time on the clock. So Jan, I think, responded very accurately and naturally. And then, yeah, bishop to c5, we were expecting these moves to come. All the moves that were played in the game, pretty much up to knight to c5, we were sort of expecting it, and then we weren't sure what would Magnus do, because he had a lot of interesting options. e5 was one of them, and white plays rook to e1, black plays rook to d8. We weren't sure what was going on here. We suspected that it was dangerous for black because of this fascinating b4 move. But it's hard to say, of course, because everything's hanging in the center. There's three pawns that are, the b pawn, the d pawn, the e pawn, the a pawn, 4 pawns which are kind of hanging, and many ways to capture them. Black can capture b4 in 2 different ways, which is unusual. So we weren't sure about this, but Magnus went for a different approach.
Well, ultimately, maybe he also agreed with the fact that this was risky because of the looseness of the a4 pawn, is perhaps why he played the forcing variation a3. But this moment here, again, leads us to the first critical moment that is very relevant in terms of what is proving to be the critical storyline of this match. It wasn't that Jan played b takes a3, Robert, but also that he played it so quickly, and in hindsight, it gave away all of white's advantage.
It really did, because the move b4, pushing through and away from that pawn, it defends the knight on c5, which is critical in many of these tactical positions where white was going to have that pawn captured, a sacrifice from black side, to get the knight on c5. So b4 would defend it. If knight takes b4, which looks like a free pawn, all sorts of rook b1 ideas getting the b7 pawn, and now you split black's queenside pawns at the end of this. Taking on a2 loses the knight, of course, and if the knight had retreated, down goes b7, and there were tactics after rook b8, knight a5, which looked very interesting. And actually, if we go through that real quick, knight b7, rook b8, knight a5, you can't take on b1, because of knight takes c6, that's a really nice tactic. You can't take on a5 because you lose your rook on b8. And if you play bishop d7, something Fabi and I talked about during one of the breaks, maybe white just plays knight to b3. And you look at the pawn structure. Black has c7 and a3. White has pawns that are coordinated, connect in the center, and white has much more space to work with.
And these were the type of lines we were not only maybe expecting, but kind of hoping we would get, right? Because obviously everyone at that point, I think, was looking forward to maybe a victory today by the challenger, something to keep this match close. Ifan also suggested, while she was with us, just shout out to Ho Ifan, suggested nice ideas where you actually kick the knight and bring the knight to e5, which is also tricky for black to deal with long term. Specifically, actually, if knight h6, sorry, rook to b1, our move again. But if the knight went to f6, Ifan's idea, knight e5, is actually very strong. And you see how hard it is to deal with this b pawn under fire and the fact that things like rook b1 are still coming. So those are the types of things we thought we might see. We had been looking at these ideas a lot. Not to be. Jan played b takes a3, and immediately we saw that eval bar set itself at 50-50 and kind of not change really for the rest of the game. Black's moves were natural. It played rook to d8 to attack the d pawn. The knight retreated itself. Magnus brought his knight back to safety. And then once that a3 pawn was gobbled by the queen, I think we all knew that this was going to be very difficult for Jan to create any more chances.
I think that we can point to b4 as the first critical moment in the game.
Yeah.
B takes a3 rather than b4.
Yeah.
We were excited about Jan's chances to push for an initiative. It remains a very sharp position, but that would definitely put the pressure on Magnus. And we have to remember that Magnus was getting low on time. It didn't play a factor in the game because his decisions at some point became easy, but it could have played a very important factor if he had been given more difficult decisions, possibly at that moment. And I think that was a moment that Jan rushed a bit. B takes a3 was played in 5 minutes, probably not enough time to fully work out the complexities of a position.
The next few moves were natural. It's still balanced, right? You see it's roughly equal, but we highlighted the storyline of the game is white has some long-term pawn weaknesses, but needs to really make sure this bishop can eventually cash in. Maybe there would be long-term outside pass pawn chances. That sort of came to pass after queen e2, h6, h4. We saw bishop d7, knight e5. Again, another line suggested by Ifan, a very strong maneuver by Magnus Carlsen to complete development. But after queen to e3, queen to b4, and the forcing lines that occurred with the b7 pawn falling.
Well, we should mention this one moment after d takes e5.
Yeah.
Magnus blundered queen e1, and he said that.
He didn't see it.
He said that after the game to Jan, that he blundered this move.
Yeah.
So he was lucky that the blunder didn't really change the valuation of the position so much, although it feels like knight to d7 was the right move here, the move we were mainly looking at.
Yep.
Knight to g4 is both an interesting move, but also a risky one, because the knight is better on g4, as in it's more aggressively placed. It's also potentially trapped. So this was an interesting moment. Magnus admitting the blunder was also interesting. But we kind of suspected that maybe queen e1 was missed because you said he looked surprised after queen to e1.
Well, I think Robert said it, and also it was it's a retreating move, right? Robert talks about that a lot, even at the highest levels. It's a move you take for granted. And as the queens were traded and b7 fell, getting to that critical moment, Robert, take us through again the chances that white maybe could have had here if not for the final blunder heard around the world.
Yeah, because right now it's white that's up a pawn, but black has the activity attacking a2, c4, and e5. So we're thinking if c5 is in the game, that's not a great decision. So maybe knight to c5 was a better choice. Giving up the c4 pawn, and after rook to c1, really either rook, it will likely transpose into the line. Black gets e5, white pushes the pawn to a4, and it's a position where the pawn quality is more important than the pawn quantity. And here it may be level, but that a4 pawn is super dangerous combined with the bishop on b7, and so black is the one who has to fight for a draw despite being material ahead.
Note that ideas like c6 now are just ridiculous because trapping the bishop is actually right where that bishop wants to be, as the a pawn would rush up the board. So it was this position right here, it was this moment, and Jan played c5.
Yeah, c5 was terrible. If we back up one move to discuss whether or not Jan had chances here, I think the one thing that we overlooked was after knight c5, black is not obligated to take that pawn. And in fact, rook to a5 feels like it probably keeps the balance completely. So that's why I think the players were discussing after the game the move f3 instead of knight to c5. Now e5 is no longer attacked, knight to h6 is forced, the knight has to drop back, and now the move bishop to e4 they mentioned. And that move actually contains the idea of knight to c5, because that knight can potentially jump into b7. Or it contains the slower idea of rook e to c1 followed by knight to c5. And maybe this was actually Jan's best chance. It's interesting that both of the players after the game were talking about this position. So they both kind of honed in on this idea of bishop dropping back to e4. It also has the huge advantage of, well, your bishop's never getting trapped again.
Yep.
On e4, it gets out of the danger zone.
Well, and it controls f5, and if we take this pawn, we start to have to calculate very forcing ideas where a4 wants to come. Not quite right away because the bishop, but...
White may trade rooks first with rook e to c1, and then, or rook e to c1, and then slowly but surely try to push that a pawn down the board, because now it's no longer covered by a rook. It's still covered by a bishop, but a bishop is not a very reliable defender.
Yep. Things like knight c5 to support a4. Note that there is no rook a8 here to go corral the a pawn, which is really huge. In fact, Black's inability to coordinate a proper defense could have spelled disaster for the world champion. But alas, it was not meant to be, because regardless of how he got there, we don't know why. We've said enough criticism in real time of whether it is playing too fast, trying to blitz Magnus, not being as focused as he should be. Jan played the move c5, and Magnus's facial expression instantly said it all, along with the eval bar. That was a blunder.
The game's over.
The game's
because
over.
As soon as Black played c6, which honestly is quite an easy move to miss, and Jan and Max were discussing this, without the pawn on c5 for White, White has the move knight to c5. So the pawn actually blocks the knight square, which means the bishop is entrapped, it's stuck, it's not getting out, and Magnus won that pawn, actually won the bishop, and then won the game in short order.
As we pointed out in real time with some fun comparisons, so how it feels to combine all your errands into one. It's not even that Black picks up the bishop, it's that the pieces coordinate along the way. And rook to b6, to give credit, was a fun little finishing idea here. It forced Carlsen to be super accurate. Fun to point out that if you don't take the rook, White will play a5 and cement the rook, and then we could really be talking about some interesting dynamics. But Magnus was as accurate, as ruthless as ever in his pursuit of converting his extra piece here, especially in this position where instead of playing quickly, he paused and realized that, you know what, as odd as this looks, I can afford to grab a pawn even with a strong a pawn on this side of the board.
Yeah, he calculated knight takes g3 till the end. Knight d4 would have also won, but prolonged the game. And yeah, it's impressive that Magnus, rather than going for the safe option, went for the slightly riskier looking option, one where, you know, we even saw lines where Black could potentially lose if he miscalculates something.
Right.
But of course, he calculated everything till the very end, and there was never a chance for the challenger.
c5, a brilliant and important move. Speaking of an accurate move that must be found in order to justify knight takes g3. Giving up that pawn opens up the bishop for defense. We had a lot of fun looking for ways that White might win this game, but ultimately after rook to a8, the pawn is stopped. The bishop will come in to help defend. This knight will continue to gobble up pawns on this side of the board, and it was enough for Jan Nepomniachtchi to throw in the towel and arguably resign his chances to become the next world chess champion. Okay, it's not over yet. A 3-game deficit is not impossible in the next 5 games, but dare we say it, is quite improbable that we might be seeing a new world champion by the end of this year. In case you didn't see, our partners at Coinbase are sponsoring Chess.com's coverage of the 2021 FIDE World Championship, and boy, are we thankful. Whether you're an experienced trader, been doing this for years, or just thinking about making your first crypto purchase, Coinbase is the place to go. Visit coinbase.com/chess and get $5 in free Bitcoin when you sign up and verify your account today.